Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. Wanted to go over a story, kind of breaking news that Biden is coming closer and closer to cracking down on domestic terrorists. And this is something that I have been talking about on this channel for a long, long time. And one of my biggest concerns is that definition of what a domestic terrorist is keeps expanding and expanding and expanding to the point where it basically is defined by someone who just has a dissenting view from the mainstream narrative or a dissenting view from the policies that the current administration wants to push. And I'm not just talking about the Biden administration. I'm talking about any administration that we have in the future, whether they are Democrat or Republican. The Republicans can be just as authoritarian as the Democrats. That's not exclusive to one color as far as red or blue. Right now, I think we are in a world where it's not about Democrat versus Republican. It's not about red versus blue. It's about authoritarianism versus individualism. And we need to make sure that we stand up and fight for individualism and the power of personal liberty. But my point there is my big concern for a long time has been the government coming after those individuals they deem domestic terrorists, and that starting to include people who just value freedom more than they value safety. And that's going to cast a very wide net across the United States. And the scary part is if you are considered a domestic terrorist, by their definition, it means that you no longer have the rights that most Americans have. So you are not innocent until proven guilty. You might be X'd out of the banking system. You might not be able to have the right of freedom of speech or the Second Amendment. I'm not sure how far the rules go or how many laws are or how many rights I should say the quote unquote domestic terrorist loses when they're put into that category, but that goes back to the Patriot Act, which again is why we can't allow the government to gain more power and control, because even if they don't use it against us today, and even if it may be used for something you deem as good today, in the future, it will be used against you and the people that you love and really care about in your life. But let's get into the story from the Washington Post. And I say that with a sigh because I, I just can't believe how they can spin this to be a good thing, but they do. Biden's domestic terrorism strategy details unprecedented focus on homegrown threats. The fact that everyone can't see the slippery slope, or the fact that there are people out there that can't see the slippery slope this puts us on, is just staggering to me. I can't understand that. The White House on Tuesday released a first national strategy devoted solely to fighting domestic terrorism. I mean, you can just see where this is going. The writing is on the wall. Is anything more crystal clear than what this country is going to look like in 3 years if we continue to go this direction? We are going to be living in 1984. That's the bottom line. But the people who are going to be positioned as public enemy number one are going to be those people who value freedom more than they value safety. And I also believe that it will include those who choose not to get the medicine, that they're going to be the boogeyman, very similar to what we saw in the 1930s in Germany. The way that that specific political party unified the people and was able to manipulate them to such a great degree is because they created a common enemy. And I think the common enemy that the administration, the central planners, the politicians, and the mainstream media is trying to create today are those people who choose not to have a medicine, or more broadly, those people who value freedom more than they value safety. Not that safety isn't important, but you've got to have a priority. Or, maybe better said, those people who believe in individualism instead of authoritarianism. Those are going to be the people, in my opinion, that will be given the title of domestic terrorists or put into that category. They're going to lose all their rights. And the next thing you know, they're going to be completely excommunicated from the system to a greater degree than they already are by losing their job because of their belief system. For many terrorism analysts, the strategy was long overdue. Violent far-right extremists have posed the deadliest and most active terrorist threat for more than 15 years. Although federal resources remain heavily focused on countering foreign terrorism. That's right. So let's just take all of our military, all of our resources, and just focus it on American citizens because that'll turn out well. Biden says we cannot ignore this threat or wish it away. Again, this is propaganda 101, guys, right here in front of you. This is, remember that series on Netflix, How to Be a Dictator? I think that's what it was, wasn't it, Josh? Like How to Be a Dictator or Being a Dictator 101 or something. This is right out of their playbook. It's how do you control a society? You try to get them to abandon critical thinking, number one. You use propaganda in the media, in the entertainment industry, and in the schools with education. And then you set up a boogeyman. You set up public enemy number one, a bad guy. And that's exactly what they're doing here, guys. They're setting up a bad guy. And you may say to yourself, okay, George, but then there's also Black Lives Matter, there's Antifa. Right. But of course, those aren't the bad guy. Those aren't not domestic terrorists. No, 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 no. You're getting that wrong. And the Washington Post sets you straight here. The Trump administration was reluctant to confront domestic extremism, or did so by touting a false equivalency between extreme right and Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and other movements on the left. So you would think that if they made the claim that this is a false equivalency, they would give some sort of proof as to why. But of course, they don't offer any proof whatsoever. They just throw that out there and make that claim that somehow you cannot compare the violence that we saw on the extreme right and the violence we saw and the destruction of private property from BLM or Antifa. When, in my opinion, I think most of the people watching this video and most of Americans that have an ounce of common sense would say, yeah, they're the same. If some guy or gal on the far right blows up a car and someone with BLM, Antifa does it, it's it's the exact same. There is no difference. But what's going to happen here is the only people that are deemed domestic terrorists are going to be the people that don't have favor with the current political administration. And this is the way these things always play out throughout history. Although the document zooms in on anti government, oh, here we go. So, this is why I say this title of domestic terrorist is going to include people who value freedom, the old school patriot of the 1780s, if you will. They're going to be the new domestic terrorist. And you can see them starting to merge these ideologies or these belief systems. So the general public, the general CNN watcher, starts to associate people who value freedom with something negative. Here's how they do it. Although the document zooms in on anti-government and white supremacist extremists. So you see, they're conflating the two. They're kind of starting to insinuate that if you're anti-government, well, then you're obviously a white supremacist. The main drivers of the domestic terrorism attacks. Oh, yeah, okay. Officials emphasize the strategy is agnostic as to political ideology. Oh, is it? Is it agnostic to political ideology? Because right up here, this exact same news outlet in the exact same article was saying how there is a false equivalency between BLM Antifa and those people on the right. So is it really agnostic when you're not even being agnostic in the article itself? Then this gentleman goes on to say we're focused on violence, not on ideology. Okay, well, if you're focused on violence, then you'd be focused on violence from BLM and Antifa just as well as violence from people who have a different worldview. Violence is violence, right? And again, the irony here is that this article is pointing out that violence is not violence. But then the quotes from the experts they use are saying something to the contrary. In this last paragraph, you don't want to be prosecuting the El Paso terrorist after he kills 23 people. You want to have prevented it, McCord said. That's the challenge because anytime you're engaging in preventative law enforcement, that comes with criticisms. As well it should. As well it should. What we have to understand as a society is you're never going to eradicate certain things. You're never going to eradicate violence. You're never going to eradicate poverty. You're never going to completely eradicate racism, although we've seen it, down to where I would argue that there's very few actual racists out there, but still, you're never going to eliminate it in any society. We're dealing with imperfect human beings in an imperfect world. So there's certain things that we just can't get rid of. So then you say, if we try to eradicate something like violence completely, at what cost? And then we need to do a cost benefit analysis, right? So let's say that we were able to eradicate the last little teeny weeny bit of violence that we had in our society. But the cost was we had to put half of Americans in jail or take away their rights. Is that cost that we paid worth the benefit? I don't think so. And to prove my point, I'd like to go to a quote that originally, or not originally, but I think this is something that Ben Franklin said. I guess originally it was probably from this gentleman by the name of Sir William Blackstone, but I think Benjamin Franklin said it and is kind of more well known for it. But it's better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer. And this is one of the things that gives us individual rights and one of the things that protects our privacy and allows the American citizen in a court of law to be assumed innocent until proven guilty. See, what's happening is just based on this Washington Post article and the direction that the mainstream media and the politicians are trying to take us. They're trying to take us into a world where you are not innocent until proven guilty. If you have a certain belief system, such as valuing freedom, well, you're guilty. And you're not even proven innocent. You are just guilty. And you need to be doxxed. You shouldn't be allowed to have a job. You shouldn't be allowed to have a bank account. And what we're seeing with the mandates, the medicine mandates, is you shouldn't be allowed to even go to a restaurant. You shouldn't be allowed to go to a gym. You shouldn't be allowed to participate in society. And this is the road we're on right now. And I think at the very least, what I want to encourage upon you is a sense of urgency that we need to wake people up. We need to understand what we're dealing with. Because if we don't, we're going to wake up in 5 years, 10 years, and we're going to be in the same position Australia is in today, if not sooner. Or we're going to find ourselves in something that looks very, very similar to a George Orwell novel or to Atlas Shrugged, or maybe in real terms, or in terms going back to the early 1900s, and something that looked similar to Stalinist Russia. All right. Anybody that thinks for themselves is a threat to the government. Exactly. That's right. Anyone that thinks for themselves, anyone that has a contrarian view. I mean, let's put things into real terms, because what I'm talking about is kind of abstract and I'm talking about concepts. Let's just put things into terms that everybody can understand. I believe that if this continues, if they're able to push this narrative, they meaning the politicians and the central planners and the mainstream media, I can guarantee you in 3 years' time, Rogan's done. Think about Joe Rogan. Think about how much influence he has. Thank goodness. But do you think that they wouldn't go after Rogan and claim that he is a domestic terrorist and therefore he should be taken off of Spotify? Therefore, he is a threat to society? And let's just go right back to the Washington Post, right here, the last paragraph. Because anytime you're engaging in preventative law enforcement, so what they can say is that, well, Rogan is obviously an extremist because of his views, and his views are just anti-authoritarianism. I mean, he's pretty much on the left, but he values individualism. So therefore, his views are extreme. And since he holds these extremist views, well, then that can lead, because he has so much influence, that could lead to potential future violence. And therefore, we need to take preventative actions to silence him, to make sure his dangerous ideas don't circulate in society. So I think that gives us an example of what we could see in the future that all of us can relate to. But it starts today. It starts with these articles in the Washington Post. It starts with the administration claiming that we need to go after that. That's our number one priority. That's our biggest threat to society, domestic terrorists. And then they start conflating things that may have a negative connotation with people that they just don't like. So therefore, the average Joe and Jane just thinks that, well, my goodness gracious, if you're someone that values individualism, if you're against the authoritarians, then you're pretty much in the same category as a racist. and racists are bad. Therefore, we should deplatform everyone who values freedom or everyone who is anti-authoritarianism. That's where this is headed. No more? Okay. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening. This article and this video hopefully will open up your eyes as to why it is so important that we stand up and fight for freedom, personal liberty, freedom of speech, and free market capitalism.